Here I have SQL Server Data Tools opened. Now, if you've used Microsoft Visual Studio, this should look awful familiar. It's Visual Studio 2012. In this particular case, I had the full installation of Visual Studio installed when I installed SQL Server and SQL Server Data Tools. And so I still have the benefit of Visual Studio. If I didn't have Visual Studio installed, then I would have gotten a shell of Visual Studio, and I wouldn't have had all of the features, particularly things like team and tools and test and architecture and so forth. But because I have SQL Server Data Tools installed, I also have this SSIS menu, and I'll talk about that shortly. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just open up that products file that I created using the import and export wizard. And that opens up the package within the package designer. And as you can see, I have a control flow with a single data flow task. And I can double click on that to come over here and see the overall steps of that data flow. So what I'm going to do now is briefly explore the various tools that are available within SQL Server Data Tools for building integration services packages. Okay, so the first thing to point out is that I have Solution Explorer over here. Again, just like any other Visual Studio project. I have a single solution called Multi-Project, and I have an Analysis Services project, an Integration Services project, and a Report project. So I have a project of each of the three major types of BI applications that Microsoft has available for SQL Server. And all I did is I just used the project templates that Visual Studio and Microsoft provides in order to create these projects that do things that allow you to build the Analysis Services project so you can build cubes and data mining models and other analytical objects, as well as reports that you can build using SQL Server data. So my main point here is just that, like other kinds of solutions within Visual Studio, you can have multiple projects open. They can be multiple kinds of projects. In fact, I could have a console application here, a ASP.NET web application as well. You know, I can go kind of crazy with what I have available. But generally, if I'm building an overall BI solution, I might have one of each of these project types open within Visual Studio. Now, I don't need an integration services project for every package that I want to create. I happen to only have a single package within this project, but if I needed to create multiple packages that do multiple things, or create child packages that are executed from parent packages, I could put all of those within a single integration services project. And then I have the ability to include other kinds of files as well. Okay, so the kinds of objects that you can add to an integration services project include things like the connection managers. These contain the information that's needed to access a data store as either a source or a destination. And they're available in Solution Explorer in this Connection Managers folder. They're created and maintained at the project level if I create it here within Solution Explorer. So these are outside of any package definition, but they can be referenced by a package. You can use these connection managers to share connection definitions amongst multiple packages within the same project. Now, the nice thing here about creating connection managers at the project level instead of just at the package level, which you can also do, is that at the project level, you can change the data connection information for multiple packages at once. I just have to change it once in that single location, and then it applies to all packages throughout that project. Okay, and then the SSIS packages folder contains the core logic and processes of the integration services project. And then if I wanted to include any other kind of project-related files, support files, maybe things like documentation files and so forth, flat files that contain data for import, I can put those here within this miscellaneous folder. Now you can access integration services functions in Data Tools or Visual Studio through the SSIS menu, the tab designer windows, and their related toolboxes. So the first thing is that SSIS menu that I pointed out earlier. So in this case, actually I want to select the package there. And now I get the full menu. I actually had the miscellaneous folder selected, and so I only had a couple options on that menu. But here's where you can choose options for setting up package logging, doing various kinds of configurations, create variables, and a bunch of other options. So you use this menu quite a bit. And then the main design surface here is this tabbed dialog. So this is where you lay out the logic of the package by dragging tasks from the toolbox to the designer to control the overall flow of processing steps. So if I go back over here to control flow, I only have a single data flow task. But I can just define other tasks here that do things like download files via FTP before importing them into a database table. So a lot of different kinds of tasks that you can include. And where you find those tasks is here within the toolbox. Actually, not within the toolbox. It's actually within the SSIS toolbox, which for some reason wasn't open. Okay. So here's the SSIS toolbox. Notice that it's actually separate from the regular Visual Studio toolbox. And so you'll get various toolboxes that are associated with some of the designer tabs. But here's where you can drag and drop components that perform the many potential actions of a complete integration services solution. If you're familiar with the web or Windows Forms development in .NET, then you'll be right at home with adding components to a package. So here's where I can add data flow task, execute SQL task, let's see, for loop, the different containers, an XML task, a send mail task, and so forth. All right, so now I want to talk more about the designer itself. The first part, and probably where you'll spend a good chunk of your time, is the control flow designer that I have selected here. Now this is the products.dtsx package that I created using the import and export wizard, but I also have an empty package over here. So I'm going to double click on open that, and there you can see what the designer looks like when you create a brand new package before you've added anything to it. So at this point I would need to start dragging tasks over again from this SSIS toolbox and populating the control flow with those tasks. Then the nice thing about this toolbox is you have a certain amount of control over the organization of the components. So for example, the components that you use most often you can include here in the favorites. By default, in a fresh installation of SQL Server Data Tools, you get the data flow task, again because that's a task that you're going to use often, as well as the execute SQL task. I find that I don't use that as often as some other ones, so in my personal machine I would start moving these around and changing the favorites. But if I wanted to add, say, the data profiling task to the favorites, I could just right-click on it and click Move to Favorites, and that would move it up to the favorites. It would take it out of this common section. And again, the common section or common tasks that Microsoft has set up. And notice down here there's other tasks, an option there. And there's a whole lot of other tasks. And so I presume based on tests, Microsoft has figured out that these are ones that are just used less often. So I can right-click on the backup database task here, and I can move it to common, I can refresh the toolbox, I can restore the toolbox defaults. So like I said, you have some capabilities for customizing that toolbox, and you're likely to want to put the ones that you use all the time up here in favorites, because they're always in view no matter how low the resolution might be. All right, but just by scanning the list of tasks here within the toolbox, the control flow items available provides a wide range of functionality to a package, including things like data operations, file operations, email notifications, loops, and SQL Server administrative options. Now, when you create a package from the import and export wizard, the wizard creates a single control flow task. So if I come back over here to products, which the wizard created, I have the single data flow task. But integration services packages can become much more complex and much more capable. And after you learn how to create workflows by linking control flow tasks with precedence constraints, and by grouping them in sequence or loop containers, you'll be able to perform most common ETL operations, and even some very uncommon ones. So, for example, a control flow might build a lengthy series of steps necessary to prepare a data warehouse for a nightly data load. So I'm going to open up another file here, another package. I'll open File. And go down here to Overview and this Nightly ETL. Okay, so I've got some errors. I created this package on a different machine, and it's not able to completely read all of the different elements. But that's not important here. I'm not going to run this package. It actually isn't completely filled out. I just wanted to show you what a more complex package would look like. Okay, so the idea here is that this is going to perform the steps that are necessary to prepare a data warehouse for a nightly data load. And so a hypothetical example of the steps that are involved there is that you first have to delete existing rows from a staging table. Then you need to download new data files from an FTP server and unzip them into a staging folder. Then you loop through the files, extracting their contents and inserting them into a SQL database table. Then you archive the flat files. You don't usually want to delete them, but you can archive them, move them to another location, and then clear out the staging folder. And then you can send an email on completion. So that would be a very typical set of steps that you might want to perform as part of that kind of operation. And that's what this package ostensibly does. Again, I didn't fully configure this. It's not pointing to valid data sources and destinations and so forth. So one of the things is that, or the first thing is you want to go ahead and download that nightly data. I can expand that a little bit so you can see the full name there. So download the nightly data. And then remember the green precedent constraint here means success, that it's going to unzip the FTP files. It's going to clean out some staging tables and then do some flat file processing. It's going to loop through the staging folders and load the data from each of those files that it finds within that staging folder. And then it archives and dumps the flat files, and then it sends an email on completion. So again, that shows you what a typical, more complex control flow might look like for a real application. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the data flow. And I'm going to come back over here to products because I want to reference a real data flow here. So again, this is the package that I created using the import and export wizard, and one that actually runs on this machine. So the idea here is that in order to manipulate data, which is the heart of most integration services packages, you're going to need to add one or more data flow tasks to the control flow designer. So you need to start by adding the data flow task here, and then you can configure the data flow tasks here. And notice because you can have more than one, there's a drop-down list that lets you select which data flow task you're currently modifying. This package only has one, so there's only one option there in the drop-down list. All right, to navigate around here, I can either select the tabs, or if I come back over here to control flow, I can also double-click on the particular data flow task that I'm interested in, and I go directly to that one. Again, that's handy if I have multiple data flows within a single package. As you learn more about integration services, you'll soon find out that the data flow is a special kind of control flow task. So it's like the other tasks in that you add them to the control flow, but it's the only task that has its own tab within the designer. And it also has its own subcomponents. So now that I'm here within the Data Flow tab, I can come over here to the SSIS toolbox, and now I have the components that appear that are appropriate for a data flow task. So there's a lot of different kinds of components here. Notice that the favorites, again, this is the default. I haven't configured this to my own taste. The default favorites are Destination Assistant that steps you through the process of creating a new data destination, and an equivalent for a source assistant to create a custom source. But there's also other sources. Actually, there's a number of different sources here if we come down here. So you can see that in integration services, I can use an ADO.NET source, CDC, a change data capture, an Excel source. I can read data from Excel files, flat files, ODBC, OLADB. This is the one to use to read data from a SQL server. You can read raw files as well as XML sources. So as you can see, there's a rich set of data sources as well as destinations. So I basically have the equivalent files down there in addition to a few additional ones, because I can write them out directly to SQL Server, to SQL Server Compact, to a record set, and so forth. And I can output them to processing and all. All right, so those are sources and destinations, but then I also can perform transformations. So here under the common are, again, the ones that Microsoft considers to be the most common that you're likely to use. So you can do things like aggregate data. You can do a conditional split to split it into two different data flows based on conditions within the data. You can derive columns. You can write some script to create new columns in the data flow. You can look up data, merge it. You can sort it. You can union it together and so forth. And then there are other transforms down here. And each new version of integration services, Microsoft adds a number. Some of them because they are supporting additional features with each new version of SQL Server, as well as just adding new components that they discover that people are commonly needing to write on their own, because you can create custom components for data flows. Okay, and then you have the same abilities to organize this toolbox as you have for the control flow toolbox. Move things around, add them to favorites, and so forth. Now, all these data tools include a wide range of objects that represent data sources and destination types available to integration services, as well as all those transformations. And again, the transformations are just special components that act on the data as it moves through the data flow pipeline. And the data flow pipeline is the representation of the path that data rows take as they move through the data flow. Because again, I have a very simple data flow here. It's just going from the source to the destination, and it maps the columns together. But you can have many, many more steps. And as you get more familiar with integration services, you could have dozens or even hundreds of steps in taking data from its source to its destination. But essentially, the pipeline connects the source outputs to the inputs of transformations, connects the outputs of transformations to the inputs of destinations, and determines the flow of the data through that package, through that data flow task. And the pipeline appears as one or more arrows between data flow components. A green arrow indicates successful flow. A red arrow indicates error outputs. So a blue arrow indicates successful flow, and a red arrow indicates error outputs. So this lets you channel data into different flows, essentially setting aside problem data for later processing, maybe even by hand. All right, the next component of the designer I want to talk about are the connection managers down here. As you can see, I have two connection managers, a destination connection flat file and a source connection OLEDB. Now remember, these were created by the import and export wizard. Now, the idea here is that many, if not most, control flow tasks and data flow components require access to external resources. They might be flat files, email, FTP servers, databases, whatever. You'll need to provide information to your package about where to find and how to connect to those resources. And connection managers are the means to that end. So this pane down here at the bottom of the designer is the central interface in which you add, modify, or delete connections to external resources for that package. It's visible at the bottom of control flow, data flow, and event handler designers because those are the designer tabs where you may need to access data. And basically what it does is just provides a convenient way to provide access to resources for your package. And again, those things like databases, text files, and email connections. Now, both of these connection managers here are package level connection managers. Remember that this is just a project. I just opened up this file. It's not actually part of this solution. And so these are contained within the package because I don't have any project level connection managers. In fact, in this solution, if I come back over here, you can see that there's no connection managers whatsoever. So these are package level connection managers. So if I make a change here, and if I have multiple packages within the solution, a change here is not going to affect other packages at all, even if it has a connection manager with the same name pointing to the same file and so forth. Separate connection managers, change here isn't going to affect the other ones. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is the event handler here. And so, well, whether you realize it or not, when you develop a package, you're programming. You're creating a set of program instructions for the integration services runtime to execute. Just as by coding in Visual Basic.NET or C#, you create a set of program instructions for the .NET Framework's Common Language Runtime to execute. And when you develop programs, you might want to plan for errors and respond to various events that occur during processing. In integration services, event handlers are special control flow tasks that run in response to various package events. So to create them, you use this event handler designer. And the process of creating event handlers is nearly identical to creating control flows, with many of the same tasks available so that you can create robust responses to various kinds of events, including when errors occur, before and after executing the package, when variable values change, and several others. And you can see the full range of events that you can define here within this event handler drop-down list box. So you can think of this as a mini control flow within this package that is only fired off in response to an event. So on information being made available, on an error occurring, on a query being canceled, on a task failed, and so forth. You don't have to implement control flows for any of these events in a package, but by doing so, you just create a much more robust package that's able to sometimes recover from errors, but can certainly perform notifications and do things like that. Okay, then there's this Package Explorer part here. One of the challenges that you'll face as your packages get more capable and more complex is that it's going to be difficult to see all of the components within the various designers. So for example, although this control flow designer here displays and shows all the control flow tasks, it displays only a placeholder for any data flow tasks that you've added. And so you saw how that worked. But it'd be very easy to have a control flow that had even hundreds of tasks. That's getting a little extreme, but it could. And there's some basic ways of navigating around the designer, so you can zoom in and out and you can fit things into a particular window and so forth. So I got a little extreme there. So I'll bring that back down to size. So you have some basic functionality for working with the packages, but if you have many tasks, it can be very hard to move around. So that's why the Package Explorer is available. This provides a significant amount of information about the parts of a package in an easy-to-navigate hierarchical format. And so if I drill down here, I can go down into the connection managers. I can see the different connection managers, because I may actually have many other connection managers. I may have variables. That one doesn't happen to. And then I have the other connection there. I don't have any log providers defined, but I have some executables, which is the data flow task. That's the single executable. I can drill down into that. That has a couple components. Remember, back over here in the data flow, there are two components, a source and a destination. So I can see all of those here. And then if I have any variables defined, and so forth. So this gives complete access to all of the components of this package, again in this nice hierarchical format. So amongst other things, it lists all of the variables that are available to the package at various scopes. So these are the variables at that data flow task scope. These are the variables within the scope of this source connection OLEDB connection manager. And then these are package level variables. And if I go ahead and expand that, I don't have any custom variables, but as you can see, there's various system variables that are available to the package. And I can use those like regular variables within the code or within the components that I execute or include within the package. All right, then there's one other pane. Actually, there's one I skipped over real briefly. You can define parameters that come into a package, and you define those there. I'm not going to talk any more about those, but like a parameter to a method within C# code, you can change, you can create a variable essentially at the package level, set a value to it, and then execute the package, and then the package will respond to the value of that variable depending on how you use it. But then the other tab that doesn't show here, because I'm not currently executing this package, is the progress pane. So the progress pane appears when you run the package within SQL Server Data Tools. It's not something you can get access to if you run the package within SQL Server or from outside. So that means that when you press F5 or click the Start Debugging toolbar within Data Tools to begin execution of the package, then the progress pane appears. It displays status information on the progress of the currently executing package, one or more packages. And then, when your integration services package fails, you'll often need to go to the progress pane to see why. Although you'll find that there are lots of ways that you can get error information from a package. And then integration services displays errors in the progress pane and usually gives a fairly detailed reason for the failure. So it makes it fairly easy to find the location of the problem. And so essentially the progress pane becomes a very essential part of the package debugging process. And then you can also find progress information in the Data Tools output window. That's just that regular output window down here, part of Visual Studio. But the progress pane usually is much more convenient and easier to read. The information is organized in a much better way.